Just a prayer. We'll have our prayer and then we'll be dismissed to class. All right. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for letting us come here today to learn more about your word. Thank you for all the many blessings. Watch over us and let us keep our hearts and minds close to you and think about the things that we learn here today. And all these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Good morning. Good to see everyone here. Bible class this morning is going to be over our next character we're studying is Job. Interesting character in the Old Testament. One maybe that we, I know for me at least, I don't know about y'all, probably just kind of overlook sometimes. You know, we read about him, we know about Job, you know, we read the story, we know how it starts, how it ends, you know, and it's like, I know that story. You know, there's a lot of valuable lessons that can be taken from Job, a lot of things that we can apply to our lives and make us better people, give us some insight in how our outlook should be on life and how we should do things, because I'm not saying that we all have the same things happen to us that Job had happen to him, but we can all have things happen to us, bad things, and he's an inspiration, should be an inspiration to us in how he responded to all those things. Looking at the book of Job, it's long been praised by some, a lot of people. I'm not really a poet. I don't really read a lot of poetry. But a lot of poets from in the past, one in particular, his name was Victor Hugo. I think he was some French poet guy from the 1800s, but he wrote about Job. He said, "Tomorrow, if all literature was to be destroyed and it was left to me to retain one work only, I should save Job." I mean, I would say the whole Bible, but he was in particular speaking of Job as, you know, just a great piece of work to read. And it is a very interesting read. I wish we had time in a Bible class so we could just read the whole thing, because I mean, it's written in a very poetic style. It reads very, very easily, and it's very interesting to how everything takes place and how it flows. Another poet, Tennyson, he was an English poet from the 1800s, said the greatest poem, speaking about Job, he said this was the greatest poem, whether of ancient or modern literature. Daniel Webster, a politician from the North in the mid-1800s, said the book of Job, taken as a mere work of literary genius, is one of the most wonderful productions of any age or of any language. A lot of people, you know, look to this, maybe even non-Christians or people that don't necessarily read the Bible as we do and a lot as we do as Christians. They would look at something like Job and say, this is a great work of writing. You know, I mean, it's a very interesting story, whether it actually happened or not, which is something we'll look at a little bit later in class. But what about this book prompts such praise from other people that maybe not Christians? I mean, I know a lot of us, or at least me in particular, you know, maybe I don't necessarily haven't looked at the book of Job that way. Sometimes we overlook it. Maybe even the Old Testament in general, a lot of times we just, you know, yeah, it's there, but, you know, we live under the New Testament. You know, that's what I really need to study. You know, the Old Testament, it's got some good stories in it, and it's interesting, but, you know, we just really look in the New Testament, because that's where we live at. But I don't think we should ever neglect the Old Testament. We should always look back to it, especially people like Job. Paul told us in Romans 15, verse 4, said, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope." Like I said, I think sometimes maybe we neglect it, not necessarily looking to some of these stories like we should, but we should be looking back, because like I said in the beginning, they do give us a lot of insight into how we should do things and how we should live our lives. The Old Testament was written for our learning, and it provides patience and comfort, and should be a great source of hope for us. This is especially true of the book of Job. James referred to it in James chapter 5 as looking to Job just to instill patience in us. Because the book of Job is, I think, sometimes maybe neglected, not looked at like we should sometimes. It does present a whole lot of valuable lessons to us. Job is the first book of 5 books that we could refer to as the books of poetry. These include Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. You know, they're just all right there together. You know, if you ever memorize the Old Testament in order. Of course, we could call them the books of poetry because they were written in such a poetic style, in contrast to a whole lot of the other books in the Bible. You know, as far as they were written more in a narrative style. Of course, we could refer to these books also as wisdom literature, especially Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Oswald Chambers, he lived in 1874. He offered this concise summary of the 5 books, basically just telling you what they were about, right? Job, how to suffer. Psalms, how to pray. Proverbs, how to act. Ecclesiastes, how to enjoy. And Song of Solomon, how to love. I mean, you could break them down simply like that. But today we're looking at Job. Who wrote the book?
Moses.
But we don't really know for sure. That's what. And when did he write? When was the book of Job written? It's interesting. I've never really thought about it until I started studying for this class, you know, about when it takes place. I mean, because when we read it, it's in the middle of the Old Testament. So, you know, Job had to take place in the middle, right? That's where he's at in the Bible. It's in the middle of the Old Testament. So, yes, like you said, Jewish tradition attributes the book to Moses. Other authors have suggested that it could have been Job himself, or Elihu, Solomon, Isaiah, Hezekiah. Many people could be said, well, maybe this person wrote it, maybe that person wrote it. We don't know for sure. It would seem that it could have been Moses, based off some of the style. Let's see. A quote from Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, commentary on the Old Testament, says, "All that can be said with certainty is that the author was a loyal Hebrew who was not strictly bound by the popular creed that assumes suffering was always the direct result of sin." Because the author gives us all the points of view, right? Like I say, of course, Daddy mentioned it in his lesson earlier. A lot of the Jews definitely attributed things that, you know, bad things happened to you. Well, you did something bad. You sinned, and that's why these things are happening to you. But whoever wrote this doesn't necessarily have that point of view. Because the author is more than likely unknown, its date it's been debated among a lot of people. Some think it was written before Moses, pre-1500 BC. Others maybe at the time of Solomon, around 900 BC. And some even as late as the Babylonian exile or later, post 600 BC. We're not for sure exactly when this was written or when it exactly took place, but the uncertainty in the author does not nullify the book's inspiration, right? For it is affirmed in the New Testament several times. Paul quotes on it from several occasions in his writings in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 13, and in Romans 11, verse 35, and also we mentioned James a minute ago as well. So I think for us as Christians, obviously looking at it, maybe we say we don't know who wrote it, but we do know it's inspired, and we do know that it belongs in our study and in our Bible, and we should be studying and look to it. So even though we might not necessarily know who wrote it, or might not necessarily know exactly when it took place, do we believe these events to be historically true?
Yes.
They really did happen? I mean, I think that a case can be made that definitely proves that, yes, these things did actually happen. As terrible as they are, this man had, a lot of wealth, a lot of family, a lot of belongings, a lot of things that were his that were all just taken away. All in, just a matter of a few days. Really terrible things that happened, but I don't see any reason why we shouldn't believe that they're not true. We could look at an example here of the writing. The style and the opening in the book of Job certainly conforms to the biblical narratives that we do consider to be historical. If we look at Job chapter 1 real quick, verse 1, it says, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil." If we look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "There was a certain man of Ramath-Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, and Ephraite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children." Luke chapter 1, verse 5. "The birth of John the Baptist foretold in the days of Herod, king of Judah. There was a priest named Zachariah of the division of Abijah, and he had his wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all commandments and statutes of the Lord." You just see that we have several other examples throughout the New Testament and Old Testament that have the same similar style to prove that, we say that, we know that Herod was a real character. We know that John the Baptist was a real character. We believe that, Samuel and all of them, they were real characters. The style of the writing of those books, just trying to point out that they're very similar in the way they start as the same as the way Job is. Also, Ezekiel chapter 14, if we want to look at for another example of someone mentioning them, Ezekiel, we'll just read chapter 14, I think verse 12. "And the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and break its supply of bread and send famine upon it, and cut off from it man and beast, even if these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord God." So we have several mentions of Job throughout other books by a lot of other great writers and other people that we obviously believe to be real people. It actually did happen. James, the Lord's brother, in James chapter 5, verse 11, said, "Behold, we consider these are those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." Job is mentioned several times throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament. So I believe Job was a real character. I believe that these things did actually happen to him. But when did these things happen?
Well, if you just look at, beginning of verse 4, we have really a beautiful description of the patriarchal age and arrangement. One of your writers referred to a moment ago said he was a Hebrew. I beg to differ with that. I don't see anything that says he was Hebrew. In fact, he predates Abraham as far as I can understand, or that's what it looked to me. So he wouldn't be one of Abraham's family. Could be, I'm not saying he wasn't. But the likelihood is he's not long after the flood, and this is how a description of a patriarchal world. This is the father offering sacrifice. There's no priesthood mentioned. There's nothing about the law, the tabernacle, the temple. I mean, no reference to the law at all. So he's certainly pre-Mosaic law. There's no question.
Well, yeah.
Otherwise, he would be described as righteous in that way.
Like I say, you look at verse 5 where he's offering sacrifices. But like I said, you pointed out too, though, that was my next point.
Sorry.
There's no allusion to the law of Moses at all throughout the whole book. I mean, that's very prevalent in, for the children of Israel. I mean, that's what they lived by, the law. And in Job, we don't read of any of that, even though it's in the middle of the Old Testament, so we know that's when it happened. It's not when it happened. Anyways. Probably, like I say, sometime, well, I mean, if you look at his age, that's what we're going to get to here in a minute. How long he lived, you would compare him to maybe even to sometime around the time of Abraham. Because, the age of men was cut down from what it used to be. 1,000 years would be way too long.
But before we get off that thought, I mean, if you look at verse 6, I can't help but think about this. I mean, I've always wondered what was patriarchal worship like. And you see the father acting as the priest for the family. He was over all, and of course he's offering sacrifices for his children. So that's insightful. But it says in verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Now, sons of God is a reference to God's people. And it was like we're here, we're sons of God presenting ourselves before the Lord here today. This was a worship assembly. And of course Satan was there, and of course, unfortunately, Satan comes here too. But Satan was there, but this is some kind of worship assembly. And so it just lets me know, it's kind of interesting to note that while it was the father leading, offering a sacrifice, there was an appointed time when the family would gather together, or the people in the community would come together and worship. How exactly, we don't know all the extent of it, but just kind of interesting to look at that from that perspective. I mean, this is pre-law, so I mean, not a whole lot of information here.
No, but he was offering sacrifices for some reason.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he had to know something from somewhere. It's just another interesting character. I mean, you have other interesting characters that weren't necessarily in the law or under the law, I mean, that we have examples of. Like I say, just trying to figure out maybe when Job lived or when these things took place. Well, he's offering sacrifices, which another interesting note about him offering sacrifices is he says, I'm offering sacrifices for my kids because they may have sinned against God and they might not know it. I mean, this is a pretty righteous man. I mean, and very God-fearing. I mean, just sit there and to think all the time, I'm going to make these sacrifices just in case my kids did something wrong. I don't know if they did or not, but, they've come together and he's like, we'll make sure that we're all covered. I want to make sure we're good.
That's kind of like saying, I'm going to whip you today because you might do something I don't know about.
Maybe. But well, of course, there's another mention in Job too that he talks about there's a mention that could be a mention of the flood in Job 22 verse 16. It says they were snatched away before their time; their foundation was washed away. We could take that as potentially a reference to the flood that happened. So, I mean, the writer here of Job is telling us probably happened after the flood. So we do know that much. And the age with which, how long he lived. His longevity is typical of the patriarchs of his time. If we look at Job, that's the end of Job. No, we want to look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar to the Lord and appeared to him. Wait, is that the wrong verse? It is. Job 42, verse 16. And after this, Job lived 140 years, and he saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations, and Job died an old man full of days. So how old was Job when he died?
Well, he lived 140 more years.
I don't know how old he was.
But he had 7 sons and 3 daughters.
He had 10 before all the bad things happened. Then he had 10 more, and it says he lived another 140 years. This is at the very end of the book. So maybe
Abraham lived to be 175, and that was described as a good old age. So by the time of Abraham, the lifespan had been cut down
Oh yeah.
significantly.
Genesis 11, verse 22 through 26 says, When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor, and Serug lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years, and he had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah, and Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years, and had other sons and daughters. And when Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. We skipped to verse 32. It says, the day of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Just trying to show that his age was very similar-ish to the time span in which maybe we could say, around the time of Abraham. Maybe he was like a contemporary, lived around the same time as Abraham had lived. It's just something I've never really thought about, like I say, in my personal view of things. Job's in the middle of the Old Testament, so that's probably when it took place. But that's not true at all. I mean, where's Abraham take place in the Old Testament? Genesis? So, I mean, that's when Job actually probably happened. Would have been around the same time, middle of Genesis. So it was just an interesting thing, you know. And of course, also, obviously, looks like he was in the patriarchal period because there's no reference to the law. He's offered sacrifices. God's talking to him directly, like in a whirlwind, out in the middle of a field. I mean, it just seems terrifying. I mean, think that God's just here talking to you. Of course, I mean, at that point in your life, after all these things have happened to you, you're sick and you feel like you're half dead, and, you know, most of your friends and your wife and everybody's, well, your family's all gone except for your wife, and they're all telling you, you just need to forget God, and now you're talking to God out in this field. I mean, I guess you ain't got nothing else to lose, so maybe you're not that scared. I don't know, but, you know, it would be terrifying nonetheless. What's the purpose of the book of Job?
Show us to keep on living.
Patience. A lot of lessons that we can take from it, though, right? I think it's a common purpose that we want to attribute to the book of Job is to answer the age-old question of why does God allow the righteous to suffer, right? I mean, we know, we see the book of Job, you know. We got the beginning and the end, but if you put yourself in Job's feet, he didn't know what was happening. He didn't know where he was going to go. All this stuff just happening to him in a short period of time, and it was really bad. So why does God allow the righteous to suffer? This is certainly the question that Job raises, but it is worthy to note that he himself never actually receives a direct answer, nor is one given by the author other than that to answer Satan's challenge, does Job fear God for nothing? Like I said, we're privileged to know the whole story. We get to see it all, but he didn't necessarily get to know all that at the time when it was all happening to him. God did allow Job to suffer in answer to that question, but Job was never told this. So, therefore, maybe the purpose of this book should be considered to be how should the righteous suffer? Is that not a lesson that we should be able to take away from Job? I mean, yes, you know, why did this stuff happen? But, you know, I think maybe we can look at the book of Job and say, well, how should we suffer? I mean, what should we do when things happen to us, when we're suffering, when things are happening to us? I think that's what Job answers for us on the large scale is, well, that's what we need to look to. We need to be like Job. We need to compare ourselves to him. Yes, at all the time. Even in the good times too, you know. Like I said, that was my other point was he's offering sacrifices for his children. Doesn't even know if they've done any wrong or not. So he's keeping his faith in the good times, which gives him, I guess, the courage to be able to have the faith to keep it through all the bad times too. So
A good example of that is when we say that God knows our heart. But God knew Job, and for certain what Job was still remaining. So saying that we know that God knows our heart, do we know that God is telling Satan, can you consider my servant Tilden? Can you consider my servant Patrick? You know, how upright he is. So when we say something to that point that God knows our heart,
Well, it was another thought that I had too while studying this is, for Job to be considered that way, that was something that, I'm looking at like, man, what if God was being able to say that about me?
Right.
What if I was to do what I'm supposed to do so that God could say that about me? I think that's a lesson that we should take away from this too, is that's how we should strive to live our lives so that God can say that about us. We might not know what's happening behind the scenes, but he can say, hey, you can try him, but he's on my side. I got him. Yes, ma'am.
Job also said, though he's slain, I trust that's putting his all loves out right there.
That's how we should all be, right? We should all strive to live that way.
But God's proud of his children, and he expresses that pride in Job. And like I said, we all would love to hear God speak that way of us. Well, we can if we just try to follow his example. But something else worth noting here. God said, have you beheld my servant Job? And Satan, you notice, he knows how to hurt us. He knows how to come at us. He knows what our weaknesses are. But what's reassuring to me in this exchange, he doesn't know our heart the way God does. He can't look into our motive and heart. He can try to twist it and deceive us and lead us astray. But ultimately, God is the one who knows what we're truly made of. And Satan miscalculated here.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think a lot of times we wonder when things happen to us why things are happening. Why does God allow us to suffer? And Job wondered the same thing. And we're told that God takes things and turns them around for his own good. And we may think, how is what I'm going to go through ever going to be turned around for good? Well, Job didn't know that either, but we all learn from Job's experience. And think about how many millions of people have learned from what Job went through, even though he never knew how it was going to be turned around for good. Like it was, all throughout the rest of the Bible and us now, we see it for good.
Oh yeah. So we get to see the whole picture of Job. We don't get to see the whole picture of our life though. We don't understand sometimes the things. Sometimes we do. Maybe something did happen earlier in our life, and then we're able to say, hey, you know what? I think that was God working in my life because that wasn't the direction I needed to go. That wasn't something I needed. But sometimes we don't get to see the whole picture like Job didn't. Maybe he did later. Maybe he realized it before he died. Later, the writer doesn't tell us that. But, maybe he really understood it later. But in that moment, that was really hard for him.
I think it's another one of those situations where, like we talked about, God knows, he knew then what was going to happen, and he knew now that we would be talking about it. And so it's an example that he was sitting in place for things to happen and evolve like they did. So we would look back and have the strength and have the faith that Job did.
Oh, yeah.
You receive it's like a curse and a blessing wrapped in one. If I can say it right. But what if we didn't suffer? Right now, there was no suffering. There was none of that with Job, even though Job went through. But the slightest thing that we go through, being weak, we disperse, we give up on God, our situation, whatever we do. But being the curse in that part, then God always manages to bring a blessing if you want to receive the blessing, if you know what the blessing really is. But if we didn't suffer as Christians now, how would our faith be in God? How spoiled would we be if we didn't suffer? So if we suffer, knowing that we need Him, then we're going to constantly stay prayerful and constantly be seeking Him. So that's what I recollect out of Job and what he went through.
Suffering reminds us sometimes to turn to God.
Turn to Him.
Yeah.
Believe it.
Well, I said sometimes probably when things are going too well for us, we probably forget God more than we should.
Come down.
I'm not saying Job was guilty of that, but I feel like that's a lesson we should take from this, is that he didn't. Even when things were good, he was still faithful. And we should be too, when things are good and when things are bad. Yeah, we need to be consistent throughout all we do.
But the key point, I think, after that is discipline and punishment. I raised my kids, and my wife and I have had a long discussion about the difference between discipline and punishment. If you discipline your children, you won't have to punish them because they understand the consequences. Here, remember what the Lord told Ananias in Acts in chapter 9. I will make him suffer great things for my name's sake. You're going to suffer. It's called discipline, character building. The Lord give it, and the Lord take it. Then you have to bless it to be the name of it.
Exactly. And of course, he took a whole lot from Job. Of course, he gave back even more, though. But like I said, Job didn't know that was going to happen either. So, so
Personally, I thought that it was kind of weird how his wife and his friends told him to turn his back against God because what God was doing to him. They just look at God. And I was like, why would he turn his back against God? God was testing him, see if
Yeah.
he would.
that's another point we'll get to in just a minute. So while Job's questions and complaints often come close to charging God with wrong, he never crosses that line, and he humbly submits to God when told that the answers to his questions are beyond his ability to understand. You know, when God's sitting there talking to him, he's like, you don't have the ability to even understand what's actually going on here right now. And he never did do that. He never did do what his wife told him to do or what his friends were telling him to do. He didn't cross that line. Another lesson for us, in our lives when things are happening, people might tell us things. Hey, just don't do that. Don't worry about it. Or just what you need to do. I mean, what does church really do for you anyways? I mean, why bother going? I mean, obviously all this bad stuff happening. I mean, so you might as well just forget. Give up. You're not going to make it anyways. It's too hard to get to heaven, so don't even bother trying. Yes, sir.
In Ephesians 6, right before we get the armor of God, there's a verse that always just rattles me. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. There's a whole lot in that verse I do not understand. But I wonder if the book of Job is a glimpse of that.
I feel like it probably is.
And when I look at it through that lens of Ephesians 6:12, when something's happening to me, it may not be about me. It may be much larger things than me. But I just have to play the role that I can and trust God to use me in the way He wants to use me. And God proved a powerful, powerful point to Satan, in some ways at the expense of Job.
Yes. But it's like I say, our lesson for us, never give up, right? Because we might not know. Job, I don't think, knew. We won't know. And like I said, good point. It could be something far bigger to do with us. We may think it is personal, but it may not have anything really to do. It's something else going on that we don't know about. But at the end of the day, we still have to keep our faith in God, follow what He says, follow His will, study His Word.
You won't put nothing on us that we can't bear. Because he said that Job was upright and yet showed evil. He also said that Job told Satan that Job feared the Lord, feared God. That carries a lot of weight. It helps us in a lot of ways that we understand and where we don't understand. I fear.
What is the fear of the Lord?
The beginning wisdom.
Ma'am?
And keep his commandments, fear God, keep his commandments.
Oh, yes. That's the beginning of all of knowledge or wisdom, right? I want to read an excerpt from a book, the book of Job, written by Brother Wayne Jackson, real quick. This is all what Brother Wayne Jackson wrote. It said, the book defends the absolute glory and perfection of God. Speaking on the book of Job, obviously. It sets forth the theme echoed in Psalms 18, verse 3. It says, I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised. God is deserving of our praise simply on the basis of who He is, apart from the blessings He bestows. Satan denied this in Job 1, 9 through 11, but Job proved him wrong in Job 1, 22, or 20 through 22. The question of suffering is addressed, why do we suffer? Who or what caused it? Why doesn't God do something? not all questions are answered, but some important points are made. Man is unable to subject the painful experiences of human existence to a meaningful analysis. God's workings are beyond man's ability to fathom. Man simply cannot tie all the loose ends of the Lord's purposes together. We must learn to trust in God no matter the circumstances. Suffering is not always the result of personal sin. The erroneous conclusion drawn by Job's friends is that suffering is always a consequence of sin, but Job proves that this is not the case. Suffering may be allowed as a complement to one's spirituality. God allowed Job to suffer to prove to Satan what kind of man he really was. Like we said earlier, what confidence God had in Job. And shouldn't we strive to have God be able to have that kind of confidence in us? The book paints a beautiful picture of patience. The Greek word is, I don't speak Greek, but hupomone, which describes the trait of one who is able to abide under the weight of trials. And from the patience of Job, we learn that it means to maintain fidelity to God even under great trials in which we do not understand what is happening. The book also prepares the way for the coming of the Lord, for the coming of Jesus Christ. His coming is anticipated in several ways. Job longs for a mediator between him and God in Job 9, verse 33, and Job 33, verse 23. And Jesus is one in 1 Timothy 2, verse 5. Job confessed his faith in a Redeemer who would one day come in Job 19, verse 25. And Christ is that Redeemer. Ephesians 1, verse 7, right? That was written by Brother Wayne Jackson. So no matter what, we need to hold on to our faith in God that things will work out for us, right? That's I think the overall picture is that if we strive, if we do what God says, at the end, we'll be with Him. Things will be better. There'll be no suffering. There'll be no tears where we're going as long as we follow that. Another practical lesson I think that we need to take away from this. Not much is said much about his wife after she tells him that he should just curse God and die. She's not really mentioned anymore. He does have 10 more children later. I don't know if it was with her, if he got another wife. It's not said. We do know she didn't die like all the children did. But I think a practical lesson that we should take away from this too, though, is that we need to be careful who we choose to be our spouse. Not saying she was bad. I mean, anybody that lives under those kind of circumstances probably going to cause you to have a lot of questions and to really doubt, yourself. So I'm not necessarily blaming her, but I'm saying that we need to be careful when we choose spouses that we have somebody who's shares our same beliefs and has our same kind of faith, so that they don't tell us to do those things. Because, like, you pointed out in our lesson earlier, the man may be the head of the house, but the woman's the neck, driving which way that goes. And who got Job closer to probably giving in to cursing God than anybody? It was his wife. I mean, he didn't. He was like, whoa, no. Now you sound like those other women out there in the town. But for a minute, he felt like almost he had a minute of doubt. Like, you know what? You may be onto something. Maybe I will. So we need to be careful. I think that's a lesson for us too. Also, be careful who we choose as our friends, who we hang out with, who our advisors are in our lives. Not saying his friends were necessarily bad people either, but they weren't giving him good advice. They were like, you did something wrong, obviously. You need to change something. This is all something to do with you. This is your fault. We need to be careful in our lives who we choose to be our friends. We don't need people trying to tell us that in our lives, because we don't know. Like I said, pointed out a minute ago by our brother over here, we have no idea. It could be some far bigger picture that we will never see, and we don't understand what's going on. Yes, ma'am?
Be not deceived, for God is not mocked. Evil communications corrupt humanity.
Yes.
Maybe your wife was enjoying all the fruits of Job labor. You know how when the ball bill make millions, you know how the wife, we gotta find a wife, and all that Job had, and Lord give and the Lord take it away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So I assume that she learned, that she understood really what Job stood with the Lord. There was no more need to mention her name.
Maybe.
Yep.
Like I say, it's not told to us. So I mean, for all I know, she repented and that's, they lived together. I don't know. It's not told to us. Don't know that it's important, but my point was just important to say that we need to be careful who we choose to be our spouse. Make sure that they agree with us and that we have the same goals in mind. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to Job's friends, if you look at those verses, his friends were good until they opened their mouths, which can kind of teach us a lesson. You know, if we're trying to help a friend or comfort a friend in a difficult situation, we don't necessarily have to say anything. Our presence with them can be support enough, because sometimes if you open your mouth, you're not necessarily saying the right thing.
You trying to say something to me?
So,
So it's better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt.